Okay, so welcome to the first of an 8-week lecture class called The Religions of Ancient Israel by Rabbi Lawrence Troster. And the purpose of the class is to try and understand what the ancient Israelites actually believed and practiced, and what were the schools that are represented in the biblical authors. What were in other words, how did they try to react to and reform what was the practice of the religion of the Israelites. So we're going to begin, first of all, with trying to understand what is religion. And that in itself is an interesting question. So if I asked you, to say, somebody just say, okay, so what is religion? What would you say?
You're asking me to tell you what I think. You're giving me the floor.
I'm giving any one of you in less than 25 words, Robert.
We trust you.
It is how people deal with the inability to come to terms with the enormity of the world by hiding behind blind and irrational belief.
Okay, that is what some people feel religion is. Irma?
I kind of go along with the first half of it and the idea of how to deal with the unknowable.
Okay.
Then I kind of veer away at the end. It's a way of dealing with the unknowable.
Okay.
And having some kind of a spiritual connection.
Rabbi, welcome. We're just beginning to start. The first question I'm asking everybody is, what is religion? And you can calm down for a minute. And Cantor.
I'll just tell you, Rabbi, what I said. The rabbi has just arrived, so I want to. It is how people deal with the unknowable and the enormity of the universe in an irrational and illogical manner.
And Irma said she agreed with the first part, but not the second part.
Okay.
Cantor, do you have anything you want?
I think it's a satisfying craving for unity and harmony and making sense of that. And I think that religion changes all the time because of our knowledge changing all the time. And it used to be that the Bible gave answers to everything, and now it's not like that anymore.
Right.
And I think it used to be that there was an answer. People assumed there was an answer. It depends if you went to the right person to take the answer from. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, that doesn't even exist anymore. There's no right person to get the answer from. There's just various. So I think that's why religion still has life in it, but it's a different kind of room is left for religion to fill.
Okay. Robert, do you want to at least close one of the doors? I know there'll be a couple of people arriving. So, and if anybody, by the way, there's tea provided there if anybody wants. I think every one of you has really touched upon some aspect of what we call by religion. And when we look at the religions of...
Did anybody say anything about making meaning?
I think that's part of what everybody is saying, that it is a meaning-created structure. I would personally say that there is a basic human characteristic that I think goes back to the evolution of consciousness itself to find meaning in the world. And that religion is can be one aspect of that. I think that it's foundational, and because the term religion today often refers to formal religious establishments, movements, doctrines, rituals. And I like to use, again, this term is not great, but I like to say there's a common spiritual foundation that all humans have. And by that I mean the need to find meaning. And the need to find meaning can be completely secular in the modern world. But everybody has to find some sense of meaning, some sense of ordering their life, as my teacher Neil Gilman would say, turning chaos into cosmos, taking the day-to-day life and trying to create some kind of order out of it. And that's, and I think that is a basic human characteristic. In fact, Viktor Frankl, who was a psychologist, who was, ended up at Auschwitz, and he came back from that experience, and he wrote book Man's Search for Meaning. A very important book. It was not only about his experience there, but how it completely transformed his view of what is essential in the human psyche. He'd been trained in the classical schools of Freudianism and the other various schools, and he came to disagree with them about what is the basic nature of the human.
Logotherapy.
He called it logotherapy, and his basic thing is the most important basic characteristic of the human psyche is the quest, the search to find meaning. And his proof is that those who managed to maintain a sense of meaning in their lives were more likely to survive the camps than those who had lost all sense of meaning, and it had only a certain amount to do with one's physical condition. Perfectly healthy people who lost their feeling that there was any meaning in the world quickly died. They often became kind of zombies. I don't know if he used the term, but Primo Levi called them, they were referred to as Musselmen. They would literally become walking catatonics. They would often walk against the electrified fences, and kill themselves. So Frankl's basic idea was that, and I think that is a really important component about what we mean when we say religion, and let's get beyond modern polemics on that. So
right, which is, I'm sorry to...
Yeah, no, please.
I actually agree with Robert on it. I just turn the whole thing on its head, because I think what's happened in the modern world is that the kind of the secular forces have sort of galvanized against, religion as it was understood or became understood in the Western world, and said religion is X and X is false.
Right.
Therefore, religion is false.
Right. And
in fact, religion is much deeper and much wider than that, and it has to do with the search for meaning, and that we are in the process of recreating our faiths.
I absolutely agree with that.
To make that meaning, including the assumptions of modern science and other things that we now understand, so that the old assumptions for sure don't work. However, that doesn't mean that we don't.
We still have
meaning.
that need, yes, and
that secular things, people by saying this is owned by religion and this is owned by secular. Right. That's a complete false dichotomy. People just make all these assumptions about what religion must be, and then say, well, that's wrong.
And I think... Go ahead.
Today, the emphasis really is on the search part, rather than...
Oh, I think that's a good observation. And I think a perfect example of that is both the original series by Carl Sagan, Cosmos, and the new one, if you haven't watched the first episode, that Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is the director of the Hayden Planetarium, who's a marvelous sort of public scientist, that you can be a scientist who like he is, an astrophysicist, and he doesn't appear to be part of any formal religious group. Nonetheless, he finds great spiritual meaning in his understanding of the universe.
So what series is it?
It's called Cosmos.
It's a new series.
Yeah, it's a new series. In other words, they decided that Carl Sagan's widow and Neil deGrasse Tyson decided it was time to redo Carl Sagan's famous series because so much new science has, especially cosmology and astrophysics, since the first series, to redo it. And
it's showing now when?
It's showing on
Fox.
It's on Fox of all things. The difference is originally it was on PBS, which meant there were no commercials. Now you have, but it's also showing in the National Geographic Channel. In other words, you can watch it at different times during the week. But it first shows up on, so you can probably pick up before Sunday the first episode. But the second episode will be Sunday night. Anyway, when we're talking about the religions of ancient Israel, we're looking at an idea that I think is even broader than we all have been talking about so far. And here, and I think it encompasses of what you're saying. Hi, Sam. Come on in. We just this is. You want to pass it? Sam, you want to get yourself a Tanakh too. I think what I want to do is, first of all, take a look at Clifford Geertz on page 1 of the material I gave you. Geertz was an anthropologist whose book, Religion as a Cultural Symbol, essay, Religion as a Cultural System, in his book, The Interpretation of Cultures, Selected Essays, has been enormously influential in terms of the way in which anthropologists and even theologians have tried to understand religion. And Geertz was a major influence on my own theology teacher, Rabbi Neil Gilman. And so let's take a look at what Geertz had to say. Erman, do you want to read that paragraph?
Religion is a system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, persuasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations in men by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence and clothing these conceptions with such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic.
In other words, a culture, it's not just a set of beliefs. It is a cultural system that creates rituals, symbols, stories that shape, that give meaning to a particular culture's existence, answers what we would call existential questions, and that system then, in a kind of feedback loop, then influences the future and all development of that system. So in our case, we have the main creation story we have is Genesis chapter 1, right? Which itself is an attempt to order the cosmos from a particular perspective, but nonetheless, because it becomes canonized and put at the beginning of the Torah, and it's read and it's studied, then our ancestors, I would say, especially in Second Temple times, then see that story shaping, it then shapes who we are. I mean, the biggest example of which, of course, is the ordering of the week into 7 days and Shabbat, for example, right? Or the idea of humans being created in the image of God, which is so important for how we shape our values. I mean, another great story, obviously, would be the Exodus story, right? Think about how, whatever the factuality of the Israelites in Egypt, the story of the Exodus, which is so central in so many biblical texts and festivals and rituals, right? The rationale and ethics, that story then becomes one of the most important or overarching, you might say, order-making structures within Judaism to this very day, right? When you hear Jews talking about human rights issues, they're often referred to elements in the Exodus story. So Geertz gives us this idea, and it's important that you understand it's a feedback loop. The culture creates these symbol stories and rituals, and then the symbol stories and rituals then subsequently shape the culture. That doesn't mean that it stands still, by the way. There is an evolution of these things. There are times when some of these symbols or stories become irrelevant or lose their meaning. And here's where Gilman used to talk about. Paul Tillich, the great Protestant theologian, talked about broken symbols, where you have a story that infused your tradition with great meaning, and you believed in its absolute truth. And then in the modern period, the validity of that truth becomes questioned, so that you can no longer look at it in the same way you did before. That doesn't mean that it doesn't still shape you. It's just, as a modern, your relationship to it has changed. Then Tillich also talks about dead symbols, ones that have become so challenged, so irrelevant, they are dropped by the wayside and have lost any sense of meaning. And I think that that Tillich is sort of
an example of that?
Well, I would say one that's on its way to that are, for example, in the modern culture, prohibition on homosexuality found in the book of Leviticus, right? When you look at the prohibition of homosexuality, or rather I would say male-to-male sex, if you want to be perfectly technical with Leviticus, because homosexuality actually is a modern concept, with the way the word is formulated. If you look at it within its context, rather than just pull it out as a few verses, it's part of a larger system of purity and holiness and prohibition of intermixing of species and kinds. And for the most part, that system, although it still has a certain validity within Judaism, has for the most part collapsed, and many of those laws are ignored completely, or are really irrelevant. And I think the prohibition on homosexuality is one of those that's just falling by the wayside ultimately, right? Because we're having total redefinitions of issues of gender and gender identity. I mean, I think the status of women is another one, right?
Yeah. You know Michael Coogan?
Yes,
I've heard
of.
He just wrote a book, Sex and the Bible.
Oh, yeah?
And no, God and Sex or something like that. I just read it in Hebrew. It was translated to Hebrew.
Oh, yeah?
But he talks about all these myths in regard to sexuality that are now being reread.
Exactly.
The problem I have, Rabbi, is
the
word religion.
Yes.
Because you see, what you're talking about, I find perfectly acceptable, and I find it a societal norm.
Yes.
However, I don't see this happening within the rubric of religion.
That's because the problem with that term is it's been corrupted to mean fundamentalist ideology. Okay. In fact, I've even heard on NPR, they actually asked a person who was a fundamentalist Christian to talk about religion in the United States, and that person conflated the word religion with fundamentalist Christianity, made no distinction between the two. And I think that's...
And Islam. That would be the other.
Well, yeah, but I'm talking about in this particular instance, and that is the problem. When people hear the word religion, they think of fundamentalist faiths. And what I'm trying to do is, if we're going to understand the ancient Israel, we have to throw that definition, that understanding out. Okay?
By what definition? What is the mindset I have to bring to this? Because
well, first
one of the reasons I was so skeptical about coming to this was the word the religions.
Exactly.
So it's societal norms?
Well, it's more than that. It's a cultural system. And now let's take a look what Neil Gilman, in talking about Mordecai Kaplan's understanding of Judaism and religion in general. Remember, Kaplan's great classic work, Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionism, was Judaism as a civilization, not as a... And what was Kaplan reacting to? Kaplan was reacting to the definition of Judaism as, number one, as law only, which goes back to Spinoza, but formally to Mendelssohn, right? In supposedly contrast to Christianity, which was dogma, or in the late 19th century, against Jewish philosophers, modern Jewish philosophers, who tried to narrow the focus of what Judaism constitutes, like the classic Reform idea that Judaism is ethical monotheism. Okay?
Reductionist kind of theory.
Yes, and what Kaplan was trying to say is that is an extremely narrow definition of what Judaism is, that Judaism is a civilization. One of my own professors at JTS, who was a student of Kaplan's, the late Robert Gordis, told us once that he went to Kaplan and said, "Don't you mean religious civilization?" And Kaplan agreed that if he had written the book later, he would have called it Judaism as a religious civilization, not just a civilization. But and so Kaplan redefined Judaism to bring in all of the cultural aspects of it, and that's why he started the Jewish Community Center movement, to try in effect to say that Jewish identity is not a narrow set of dogma. And listen, look what Gilman says about what Kaplan talked about. George, you want to read that?
Mordecai Kaplan used to teach that there are three possible ways of identifying with a religious community. By behaving, by believing, or by belonging.
That's an important point, right? That behaving, the rituals, prayers, even ethical things, right? Believing, elements of faith, right? Principles of faith. It doesn't have to be a dogma. Or belonging, group identity. Read on, Kaplan himself.
Kaplan himself insisted that the primary form of Jewish identification is belonging, that intuitive sense of kinship that binds a Jew to every other Jew in history and in the contemporary world. Whatever Jews believe in, however they behave as Jews, serves to shape and concretize that underlying sense of being bound to a people with a shared history and destiny. But you could say it would be very hard to separate this from certain national identities.
Yes.
Right? Imagine the German national identity or the American national identity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the point is, in the modern Jewish era, starting in the 19th century, this is why Jewish nationalism arises, which eventually becomes Zionism. The notion of the Jews as a people, right? Which was not a big deal in the Middle Ages. Most Jews define themselves as a dot, a faith, whatever. The point is that in the modern period, it is that sense of belonging to a group. There's a famous joke. Guy is asked, why does he come to shul every Shabbos? He's an atheist. He says, well, Schwartz comes to shul to talk to God. I come to shul to talk to Schwartz. Okay, in other words, and I actually had a person in one of my congregations say, he belonged to the Arbeiter Ring, the workman's circle, and he says, I come because I feel an obligation as a member of a people to come to shul on Shabbat.
I have to share this because it's one of your students, and Jerry Ozer just passed away.
Yeah.
And this story about him just captures this so perfectly because this is years and years and years ago, back in the 60s, I guess, when his son was like 8 years old. His older son came home and said to him that, I don't understand the point of being Jewish, right? And, then his wife Harriet, if I remember, blessing, said we got to send him to the synagogue. And Jerry himself was an atheist, but he said, look, he agreed with her. He said because to be an atheist Jew is okay, but to be an atheist that's a problem. And that is exactly that point. I mean, it's the peoplehood that was the foundation for so many of American Jews, still is, and that's what Kaplan addressed uniquely. And
he was the first.
And made him so successful. So successful, in fact, that he couldn't maintain his own movement because everybody agreed with him. Right. Ultimately.
Right.
In the liberal movement.
Kaplan was the most influential Jewish thinker of the 20th century. And regardless of whether you're a Reconstructionist or even Orthodox, everybody was influenced by Kaplan. It's whether you either had to agree with him or you had to disagree with him, but you could not ignore him.
My point was sort of looking at the same thing from the other side. Mm-hmm. Why is it what distinguishes this religion from something we wouldn't call religion, which is Americanism, the belief in our independence, this can-do attitude, this idea of all of these American exceptionalism. We're the people who can. I mean, it is a set of beliefs. We sit within it. We adhere to it. Yep. It gives this mood. It gives these.
Robert, the one.
You're the doorman today, Robert.
All right, come on in.
You're speaking on the doorman.
George, I understand that, and
but I think there is a difference.
Yeah.
And I think someone has to articulate what that is.
Well, on a fundamental level, there actually isn't a difference. In other words, Neil Gilman has always said to us, it's not ritual or no ritual, but which ritual you choose to practice. It's not symbol or no symbol, but what symbol. When you look at the way people venerate the American flag, that is a symbol that is as powerful to the people who do that as the symbol of the Torah is for us. So whether you define it as religious or look at it in a more basic anthropological way, it's exactly the same, right? I mean, think about...
Well, if it is the same, that's why we call it idolatry.
Well, it can be idolatry from a Jewish perspective. Okay, yes. All right. But looking at it from a neutral perspective, it has the same characteristics. And by the way, as moderns, we can, of course, be part of more than one of these communities, right? We can be part of the American community that you described so well, is part of our identity, right? Is an important part of our identity. It's not just your passport, right? It's more beyond technical citizenship. And yet we are also part of a Jewish religious civilization. Now, we may be part of other ones, sort of subsets, right? People for whom a certain sport is their religion. Like people talk about how in many southern states, Friday night football at the high school is their religion, right? It can happen. So the question is, are these...
I mean, being a baseball fan, I mean,
exactly.
These are actually like different, you could call them religious phenomena.
Yeah, exactly. They definitely are.
By this definition, this is social anthropology, and I think it works beautifully.
Aptly.
And does describe it.
So then how does this apply to ancient Israel? And I think that it does. Because when you actually look at, as we'll see, when you actually look at the religion of the way Israelites believed, it was not just about a set of beliefs or a set of rituals. It was it was one of these overarching structures that saw an intimate relationship between the land, the people, and God. Right? And I think that that's something that, again, because of the way we view modern religion as a set of practices or as a set of beliefs, I think that we forget how much peoplehood and what we would call national identity was intimately connected in ancient Israel. What happens is, of course, that in the Second Temple period, that sense of the centrality of what we will call ethnicity never disappears, but it becomes less important with the evolution of a diaspora, where Jews are living in many different countries, adopting the cultural norms of those countries, and yet remaining loyal Jews. And the greatest example are the Jews of Alexandria, or the Jews of Egypt in the Second Temple period. They assimilated into the Greco-Egyptian culture of Egypt under the Ptolemies. We know from court records that still exist from that day, their names were the same as everybody else's. They did not have there were no particular Jewish occupations. They had a variety of occupations. We know from physical descriptions they looked like their neighbors, which, by the way, always happens to diaspora communities. After 100 years or so, they begin to look like their neighbors because of what we will call intermarriage, okay? They spoke the same language as their neighbors. In other words, the Alexandrian Jews did not create a Yiddish, a mixing between Hebrew and late Greek, okay? They spoke pure, what's called Koine, the Greek of that period,
You're
right?
talking about Babylon?
No, I'm talking about Egypt.
Second Temple period.
This is Second Temple period, middle Second
that
Temple.
Sense of belonging somewhere else where you're not.
I'm giving this as the best example. I'm just giving it as an example. And yet, and by the way, they didn't wear any different clothes either. There's no evidence that Jews wore distinctive clothing, that they had tzitzit, for example. And yet, despite all of this, we would call this a highly acculturated, maybe even assimilated community. And yet they were extremely loyal to their Jewish identity, so much so they went to war with their neighbors numerous times. Right? In other words, there were outright riots and wars between Jews and Greeks in Alexandria, what we would call, ethnic conflicts. Yeah, more than civil unrest, literally wars in some cases, sometimes just riots. But, and by the way, it was one of the things that led to basically the destruction of that community. I mean, when you look at their cultural production, they also utilized many Greek cultural forms that they recast in Jewish structures. For example, we know of at least one, and there were probably others, of a Jewish playwright in Alexandria who wrote using Greek dramatic forms at least one play, we only have fragments of it, of the Exodus, right? His name was Ezekiel, and we only have him because he's quoted in a later church father, but he probably wasn't the only one. We just don't have most of that civilization's a lot of that civilization's material did not survive.
Which period you referring to in Alexandria?
From the time of from the founding of Alexandria by actually under the first Ptolemies. So the 3rd century, early 3rd century BCE until the end of the 1st century CE. When the community really, the beginning of the 2nd century, when the community was virtually destroyed because of these outbreaks of violence. And I've always said it would have been fascinating if that community had survived. We would have had an entire branch, not even branch, a whole kind of Judaism that was not rabbinic, right? A totally different kind of Judaism. Okay, so let's get specifically to the religions of Israel. And I'm using the term in plural because, as you will see, there isn't a unity of all of these things. There is a tremendous diversity and variety. So, first of all, Carol Myers, who is an extremely important scholar of biblical material and archaeologist, wrote a book on it's called The Religious Households and Holiness, the Religious Culture of Israelite Women. Where she, we'll talk about it, we will get to it in detail, but she essentially challenges a lot of the characterization of Israelite society by previous scholars who tended to privilege the public form of religion and did not look at the household religion enough, which was mostly under the sphere of Israelite women. But this is how she defines the religions of Israel. Robert, you want to read it? Starts at the bottom, page 1.
Israel have two interconnected components. First, a theological one, beliefs in supernatural deities or powers recognized by the group or groups to which people belong. Second, a behavioral one, appropriate responses to those powers, responses that were meant variously to praise, appease, or somehow manipulate the impact of those divine beings on people's lives. Okay, so you can see there the notion of belief and behave within the context also of belonging. All right? And we're going to look at those things separately. In other words, next week we're going to look at the belief part, namely the character of God and the creation theology as two essential parts of what we might call the belief structures of ancient Israel. And then on April the 2nd, we'll look at the behavioral part, the worship, the rituals, the shrines, all the various aspects of that we can get, as you will see from various kinds of things. Lastly, I want to look at Stephen Geller, whose this course was inspired by his essay in the Jewish Study Bible on the religion of ancient Israel. And this is what Geller wants us to understand, and this is going to be the hardest part for us, to understand that the texts in the Bible are from a small, elite, dissident series of groups. Because the Bible is the Bible, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, it's very hard for us to get away from the fact that what they say is what people did. Robert, you want to read that one as well? Biblical religion? Biblical religion was a minority, dissident phenomenon, always at odds, as the Bible itself states, with the actual religions of the small kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Moreover, biblical religion is not a unity, but rather a congeries of differing and often competing opinions and tradition.
Congeries, great word. I had to look that one up. It just means that it's only in the plural, apparently, and it means a collection or assortment. Okay? There's no such thing as a singular congery. Okay? But anyway.
It couldn't be a group that, really?
Yeah, I looked it up. Anyway, this is a very critical point, that most of the biblical texts, and again, even ones that aren't, are collected by people later on, right? A lot of our biblical texts, in fact, are collected and edited in the Second Temple period, which has an impact on which ones got selected and edited and so on. But all of our biblical sources, especially if we look at the Torah, for example, are from groups that were small, dissident reformers who didn't like what most people were doing and were trying to change that. And because their text became canonized and survived, it had a profound impact on the subsequent character of what we will then call Judaism, as opposed to Israelite religion. And I want to make a sharp distinction between those two, by the way. Everything from in the First Temple period we are referring to as Israelite religion. In the Second Temple period on, we are calling it Judaism. And I think it's a very important distinction. Now, Judaism obviously comes from Israelite religion. But the fact is, there is a very big difference. There's a lot of things that divide it, as well as bind it together. And we'll talk about that eventually. Yes, Robert?
When I look at the priestly school,
yes,
I think of it as authoritative in terms of the time. And you have just said to me, I am completely wrong.
Yep.
That the people that wrote the priestly, the Levitical statements,
yep,
were essentially heretics of their time.
No, they were reformers or revolutionaries. You can look at them either way. Because if you actually look at what they're saying, and we'll look at that, there's a lot of stuff they're talking about which is a reaction. And don't forget, they didn't represent the whole priesthood. They only represented a faction within the priesthood. So,
that makes it much more complicated.
It turns out they're the guys who wrote the stuff that survived, but if you actually look in the sources, as we will, they are reacting against a lot of the ritual practices that were going on.
There's an incompatibility in my little brain, and that is, you said it was an elite group.
Yes, a very elite group.
And then you said it was a dissident group. An
elite dissident group. Elite because they were literate, and most people were not literate. Okay? That's the thing you have to really understand, that your average Israelite was illiterate. Right? And secondly, even within, if we take the priesthood, for example, there are different groups within the priesthood. What we call the P school is one of those groups, and the D group, the Deuteronomy people, is another subtext, because most of the Deuteronomy people were priests. Okay? And they are dissidents. Now, sometimes the dissidents get control of things, like what happened in late Second Temple period under Josiah, where the Deuteronomy people converted Josiah to their view of things, and Josiah immediately makes all these radical reforms, like shutting down all the local shrines and temples and centralizing all the worship in Jerusalem. Okay? But that's the D people that was a big success for them. But up until that time, they were, Hezekiah was probably influenced by them as well, but they were a dissident group.
Well,
Jeremiah was probably part of that group, by the way. Yeah.
Wouldn't you say the New Testament was also written by a dissident group?
There you get into something I will call sectarianism.
How about the Quran?
Well, I can't speak for that, but I think you're somewhat correct in the New Testament. When you look at sectarian groups in the Second Temple, they are definitely dissident groups to the establishment. A sectarian group usually defines itself against the majority within as opposed to without. So the early Jesus followers, as I prefer to call them, and most scholars do, were a dissident group within the Jewish community of that period of time, Roman occupied Judea.
Dissident like dissonance, or what?
No, dissident in the sense of protest, in the sense of
against the majority.
Against the majority. Exactly, a
but
small group against the majority.
My point was really, almost every great movement is a dissident group. I mean,
yeah.
when you look at these kinds of works.
You know?
And usually the dissident groups are started by elites.
Of course. Yeah. Who else starts anything?
Well, I mean, you say with like the American Revolution was not led by a majority. There was no majority in favor of fighting the British.
Exactly.
It was a dissident group that got enough support to actually form an army and
usually in the modern period, most of the revolutions are started by middle class people. And if you actually look at what's going on in some, like in Egypt and other places, it's the middle class that's starting these revolutions, not the upper or the lower classes. All right? So in the modern period, it's often a middle class group, an educated group, and and even in the Middle Ages, I think the peasants' revolt in England were started by people who could read.
Right, they weren't such peasants. The ones who started.
They got the peasants moving, but
Yeah, right.
Okay, so that's really what we're going to be looking at. We're first of all going to try and establish what did your average Israelite actually do. And to do that, we are going to look at biblical sources, but we have to be extremely careful with biblical sources because they are edited and collected by the dissident groups. Now, there's a lot of times we can actually find stuff that was incorporated by these elite groups into their material that actually predates them and reflects the Israelite religion. You find this especially in the Psalms because the Psalms is a broad collection of poetry, and you don't find a kind of ideological stamp on the Psalms. Okay, that's going to be one of our chief sources. But also, again, I'll get to that. But first, I want to, and for some of you, you've heard me do this part before, but I want you to understand, first of all, when we talk about the Bible, we're going to be very specific about what we mean by that, okay? So first of all, when people say the Bible says, my first question is always going to be, which Bible are you talking about? And here I've given you a list of the different biblical collections, the biblical canons. Of course, we know our Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, is this one right here in front of us, is based on what's called the Masoretic text, which is a particular a version of the Hebrew Bible, which we know had the evolution of the Masoretic text goes all the way back. We found Proto-Masoretic texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we also know there were other Hebrew manuscripts floating around that are the same but somewhat different as some biblical texts, such as the Greek translation is the Septuagint translation of the Torah is probably based on a different Hebrew text than the Masoretic text. Okay, so that's number one. Then you have the Greek Bible. That's the Bible of the Jews of Alexandria and Egypt. The first part of it is the Torah is translated, I think, in the 3rd century BCE, and then subsequently the other books. Now, if you look at the Septuagint, it looks pretty much the same as the Tanakh, but there are books in there that are not in the Masoretic Bible. Now, those books, which are referred to now as the Apocrypha, some of them were written in Hebrew or Aramaic and got translated, and the originals got lost. A couple of cases, the originals got rediscovered. Others were written in Greek to begin with, and the Greek community venerated, the Greek Jewish community venerated those texts. But the rabbinic community, which established the final canon of the Hebrew Bible, did not.
What's venerate?
Considered them sacred.
So Septuagint includes the Apocrypha.
Yes, the Septuagint includes what we call the Apocrypha. You have to stop thinking of the Apocrypha as separate. It only got separated by the Protestants, actually. Okay? Yes, Robert?
I had thought that the Masoretic text referred to what the Ben Ashes did in Tiberias.
Yes, it is. Technically, yes.
And that was when the vowels were added to the
Yes,
consonants.
yes, but the Masoretic text, in fact, is the rabbinic the rabbinic version of the Hebrew Bible that predates the rabbis. In other words, the evolution of what became the Masoretic text, we find evidence of going back to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay? So it is a Hebrew manuscript collection or Hebrew collection of biblical texts that predate the Masoretes. Okay, they're the ones who put it into the final authorized form. Okay?
When did they do that?
They did that in the 10th and 11th centuries.
You have to do a review class on the Tanakh.
Okay.
You did that class.
Yeah, I have.
We've all forgotten.
Right. Okay, so then you have the Catholic Bible, which represents the original Christian Bible, which was the Christian community utilized the Septuagint, because they were Greek speaking, as their version of what they called the Old Testament, to which they added the New Testament, which was in Greek, right? And in the Western Catholic Church, they utilized the Latin translation of that collection, which is known as the Vulgate, done by Jerome. Now, they included what we call the Hebrew Bible, the apocryphal books, and the New Testament, although Jerome noticed that very likely some of the apocryphal books were probably not, he knew, because he knew Hebrew, when he translated the Vulgate, he knew they were not part of the original Hebrew. Now, when the Protestants came along, Luther decided to exclude what we call the apocryphal books. In fact, that's when it was pushed off as a separate collection. And so in Catholic Bibles, you will see these apocryphal books integrated into what they call the Old Testament, right? In Protestant Bibles, they often are not there at all, or they're pushed as a separate collection, as an appendix, okay? Now, when you get to the Eastern canons, which include the Greek Church, the Russian Church, the Georgian, the Syriac, and the Ethiopian, they began with the Septuagint, the New Testament, plus other works depending upon the denomination. Again, these are works that sometimes are from Christian authors, often ancient Jewish authors which were originally written either in Greek, Aramaic, or Hebrew, which did not survive in their original Hebrew or Aramaic for the most part.
What do the Copts follow?
The Copts that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, they are a very old Eastern.
Go back earlier than
exactly.
Others.
You know,
they're
I don't.
hanging around with the Jews in Alexandria.
Yeah. I don't know. That's a good question, Jordan. I don't know. I'll take a look at that. I think probably the Coptic canon is probably similar to the Catholic Bible, but I'm not 100%. Except it's in Greek, but I'm not 100% sure. That's a good question. Okay, so then moving on. When we now focus on the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, essentially, we have to always understand it's a library and not a book, right? This is, again, is a misnomer. People often says, the Bible says. So after the first question, which Bible are you talking about? I would say, what book are you talking about, right? And so the Hebrew, the Masoretic canon is divided into Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. By the way, the Septuagint has a different categorization. They do have the Torah, but then they have what's called the histories. I mean, it's the order of the books, even within the ancient Jewish community, was not always the same. Even in the rabbinic community, by the way, was not always the same. But broadly speaking, the rabbinic canon of the Masoretic text is divided into the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Okay, and here you see each of the books. So as you can see, if you take the 12 as one book, and 1st and 2nd Samuels and Kings and Chronicles all as one book, and Ezra and Nehemiah, there are 24 books in the Masoretic canon. Okay? Now, each of these books has a history, and they are canonized or edited or compiled over hundreds and hundreds of years. Right? They're not all written at once. They're not all created sacred at once. The Torah is obviously the oldest. We know by the end of the 5th century BCE, it's in the form we have it today pretty well. The prophets are probably gathered together are gathered together by the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, and also probably most of the Psalms are.
By which century?
2nd century BCE, by around 200. And then the writings are kind of a hodgepodge after that, right? For example, in the Qumran community, there we've found fragments of every single book of the Bible, but not the book of Esther. So the people at Qumran did not think the book of Esther, and I think for pretty good reasons, was not sacred. At least negative evidence suggests that, right? If you come to my Torah study this Shabbat, we're going to look at the Alexandrian Jews' additions to the Book of Esther, because they didn't like the Book of Esther the way it was, and they added a bunch of stuff. That's what my class is going to be this week. I asked Jordan last week. I said to them, I gave them a question for this coming week, which is Elias Bickerman wrote a book called 4 Strange Books of the Bible, and Esther's one of them. So I asked the question. I want everybody to think about, why is Esther a strange book?
Have you just given us the answer?
Yeah, that's right.
The question you will is, why is it a strange book? And that's because it's a strange book. Alexandrian Jews added to it, but the question is, why did they do that? Okay, why is it a strange book? But that's a little taste of what's to come.
It's a very unusual book.
Yeah, it is a really weird book. And so the last point I want to make, of course, is that even within books, there are often more than one voice and more than one source represented. And that, of course, especially is true in the books of the Torah, which, of course, the famous documentary hypothesis of J, E, P, and D, right? The various schools. But even within those books, there are documents that predate those schools. And then when you expand it to look at, for example, the book of Psalms, it's virtually impossible to date the book of any of the Psalms, but we can tell some of them are much earlier by the language. And it's evident that some of them are pieces of liturgy from the temple, probably the Second Temple. Some of them are individual poems. So there is a huge diversity of voices that are found within the Hebrew canon. Again, some of them are these dissident groups, and they shape the Torah, and they shape most of the histories of Joshua, Judges, Samuels, and Kings, although, again, they're quoting earlier stuff, which is why we can sort of pull out some of this. But again, we have to understand that they all, especially these 4 broad schools, they got an agenda. They have a definite ideological agenda as to which texts they picked and how they shaped them. And that's something that's important. The other point is that, and of course, when you get to this, a number of the books of the Hebrew Bible are not written until the Second Temple period, like the book of Esther, like the book of Ecclesiastes, and the book of Job. They're not even composed until after after the fall of Israelite religion, but they sometimes preserve really early material, like the book of Job has some really early ideas that are preserved within, even though it's written in the early Second Temple period. Then again, you get somebody like Ecclesiastes, who is like completely, totally away from much of what passes for Israelite religion. Okay? So again, it depends on when the book was written, what voices are within it, and the last point is what's called intertextuality, where you often find later texts commenting on, disagreeing with earlier texts. Sometimes it's in the form of, in the legal codes of Deuteronomy, for example, they're often reacting to or amending or adding to the law code in Exodus, which is older. So you have this conversation sometimes going on within the Bible. That's of less importance to what we're doing, but it's something we always have to be aware of. And one obvious example I always like to point out is the end of the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes. He's read Psalm 8, and he thinks it's a pile of nonsense. And he says so, essentially. I mean, scholars are really sure.
Who are you talking about?
Ecclesiastes, Kohelet.
But
the end of chapter 3, he has read Psalm 8. and he is disagreeing with it. He's disagreeing with the whole idea, going back to Genesis, that humans are somehow different from animals. Okay, so any questions before we move on? Yes, Robert.
Where does the Talmud fit into this?
Oh, that's completely out of our purview. I mean, you do find in post-biblical sources, meaning stuff that is outside the canon, in the Second Temple period, like Dead Sea Scroll material, like what's called, even beyond the apocryphal material, what is referred to as pseudepigraphal, all these texts which sometimes preserve some very ancient stuff. And we'll actually look at some of that, like the Book of Enoch, for example. Parts of the Book of Enoch go back to the early Second Temple period, but some of the stuff in the Book of Enoch actually reflects things that were going on in the First Temple period. Sometimes rabbinic midrash preserves really ancient materials and themes that go back to Israelite religion. But you have to understand, you're talking 1,000 years later. Okay, so what are the sources to try and, if we're going to reconstruct the religion of ancient Israel, where do we get it from? Well, yes.
So you say that this chapter 3 is going against some...
The last
She's checked it out.
The end of the chapter?
The last 6 or 7 verses.
I have.
I'll show you later. I'll show you what I mean later.
Okay.
So first of all, the Bible the Tanakh will still be our major source, but we have to interpret them very carefully. But there are some texts that scholars have identified as really early material, and they tend to be poetry. Okay? So grab a few more Tanakhs for those who don't have them. By the way, you don't have to bring your own Tanakh. There are plenty here. Jordan, you want to pass that down to Paul and Ellie? Let me give you another one. If you open up to Exodus chapter 15, this is an example.
15?
Chapter 15 of the book of Shemot. This is the song at the sea, right? Page 144. So if you go to chapter 14, it tells that there is a narrative, the story of the splitting of the Red Sea, right? We all know that story, okay? Then chapter 15 is the song that supposedly was sung after they got through the Red Sea. So this poem has been put within the context of the narrative. Now the narrative comes, I believe, it comes from the e-source primarily. And so whoever that group was took this poem and put it within the context of their narrative. But if we forget that narrative, and it's really hard to, if we just look at this chapter as a work unto itself, it is probably talking about the splitting of the Red Sea, but it's done in a totally different way. And its view of God is also quite interesting. We're going to look at this in more detail next week, but effect is this is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, text in the entire Hebrew Bible.
How do you determine that?
By the language.
I know we had this.
Philologists, Hebrew philologists, and historians of the Hebrew language have basically determined that this is the oldest text. Now, there are those who say, well, actually, it probably isn't, but somebody was writing in the style of it. It's like today somebody writing a Shakespearean sonnet in perfect Shakespearean English. Occam's razor says the simplest explanation is this is a very early text. Okay? It's highly unlikely people, in my opinion, intentionally created archaic texts so perfectly.
But they compared it to other texts, no? That they could prove.
But that's the point. There are many other early texts as well. Okay.
From outside of the.
And outside of what? The book of Exodus?
Yeah, that you can compare the grammar.
Yeah, we can compare it to a couple other ones. Okay, like the Song of Deborah in chapter 5 of Judges is also an extremely early text, and you can compare it. And many of the Psalms. And I've given you, as a matter of fact, I gave you here a number of poetic texts that are considered some of the earliest sources in the Bible. Exodus 15, Judges 5, Psalms 18, 29, and 74. We'll look at Psalm 29 in a minute. But the point is, these are extremely early sources. And when you actually look at the way God is portrayed in this text, this is one of our earliest sources in the Bible itself for Israelite religion.
So Song of Moses, not as old.
It's also a very old. Song of the blessings, really? the Testament of Jacob, yeah. the Hazinu, that's extremely old.
Because that's a completely different view of the Exodus. I mean,
yes, exactly. In other words, that's another one we'll look at. One of the last chapters of the book of Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomic author took this poem, which is extremely ancient, and put it into his or their narrative. But in fact, if we amend one word in it that most scholars believe it actually refers to other gods. Okay, so it's a very early text. All right. Let's take again, we're not going to look at this in detail because it's too complicated, but take a look at Psalm 29 as another example of this.
We're not going to spend any time on Exodus 15, Rabbi?
We are going to look at it, but it's a little long, but take a look at Psalm 29. This is a little shorter, so it's a little easier to point out a few things. There's been a lot of arguments over Psalm 29. There was a theory. I think it started with H.L. Ginsburg, the Bible scholar, that Psalm 29 is in fact a translation from a Canaanite psalm. That if you put Baal instead of Yud He Vav He in there, it's a perfectly good Canaanite hymn. Now, there's been a lot of argument as to whether that's true or not, but the fact is the portrayal of God in Psalm 29 is extremely ancient.
We actually have texts of Canaanite hymns?
There are fragments of Canaanite Ugaritic.
1443.
1443. There's a lot of disagreement there's a lot of argument over the relationship of Canaanite literature to biblical literature. But yeah, there was one scholar who wrote the commentary for the Anchor Bible series who claimed that all the Psalms are essentially, sort of Hebrew versions of, that the Canaanite influence. He read all the Psalms virtually in light of Canaanite stuff. A lot of people feel that's a little simplistic. But the fact is, there was a whole tradition of Canaanite poetry that, again, that's one of the things we'll talk about is that the Israelites were in a particular cultural milieu that you can't separate them from. Okay? They were part of a broader religious civilization, which scholars refer to as Northwest Semitic, as opposed to the Mesopotamians.
And they have this theme of bowing down that is so...
Well, take a look at it. First of all, Havu Ladonai B'nai Elim, translated as divine beings, but sons of the gods. Right? In other words, and when it talks about the voice of God is over the waters, what water are we talking about? The primordial chaos. The picture of this is of God as a storm god, right? Breaking, this is a storm. God coming in a storm, right? With thunder and lightning. And if you take a look at the end, verse 10, it says, Adonai lamabul yashav. Now, it says the flood here. People assume that means Noah's flood. In fact, it's the primordial chaos at the beginning of creation. It has nothing to do with Noah's flood. This is a very ancient poem used in the temple, probably. It's a piece of liturgy, okay? Used in some kind of temple ceremony. That's one of the problems.
We still use it.
Yes, we still use it, but its language is fairly, most scholars feel this is one of the oldest Psalms there are. The tendency is the oldest Psalms tend to be in the early part of the book of Psalms, and the later ones tend to be in the later part, but that's not always 100% true. I'll give you another example.
It's interesting. It doesn't have any of that Tovishemo, Toviemo, all that stuff that is in the Song of the Sea. Completely different Hebrew here.
It is a different Hebrew. It is definitely a later Hebrew. It's not as old as the Song of the Sea,
So
but
how do they?
it's just the characterization of God here is extremely, very much like
Nature kind of thing?
like Baal, the Canaanite god. Okay, very much like the Canaanite god, the storm god, and that's actually when we look at the ideas about God, we will see how people depicted God, both poetically, but also even some visual stuff that we have found in archaeology, which suggests the same things.
Do we know how the Psalms were they independent scrolls, or how were they found?
They were edited. There's a series of sub-collections that are actually within the Book of Psalms, and so people believe that there may have been some that started as liturgical collections, and then there were individual ones, and bit by bit it kind of like grew, right? You can actually find several sub-collections within the Book of Psalms. It's very difficult to do this, but you can actually more or less trace how the book, because actually there are 5 books in the Book of Psalms, and to match the 5 books of the Torah.
But were they found like on stones or like the
No,
pillars of
no, they haven't. They haven't found that. But don't forget, they found Psalms in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are probably as old as many of the Psalms that aren't in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In other words, this is a collection which is a selection. There was probably a much bigger corpus of liturgical poetry, that most of which has been lost, but some of those stuff in the Dead Sea Scrolls were not written by them. They were preserving stuff that didn't make it into the Bible.
I'm wondering, like in the Eastern religions, the Zen gurus write poetry all the time.
Yeah.
That's part of their expression.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So maybe it was something...
Well, we know that some of the Psalms are undoubtedly compositions by individuals, right, that got preserved. But other ones are obviously representing some kind of public ceremony. It's very difficult to know. All right, I'll give you one other example of that. If you look at Psalm 24, a well-known psalm that's used also in the synagogue. If you take a look at the last part of it, and again, sometimes psalms may have been edited, like in a psalm there may have been like more than one text that was put together. That may be the case here. If you take a look in verse 7, it starts off this famous thing, we often, there's all kinds of melodies for it. Su'u she'arim roshechem, O gates, lift up your heads, up high, you everlasting doors, so the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord, mighty and valiant, the Lord, valiant in battle. By the way, a lot of early texts is God as a warrior, by the way. Oh, gates. So what does this represent? Some people feel this represents an actual ritual that occurred in the temple where they opened up the temple gates and something like the ark or something was ceremoniously marched into the temple to reenact the enthronement of God over creation. In fact, some people think that this was done on what we now call Rosh Hashanah, that the origin of Rosh Hashanah was an enthronement festival. Because there are such things in other ancient Semitic cultures, right? And this is a very controversial idea, by the way, but this from verses 7 to 10 doesn't seem to have a heck of a lot to do with the earlier part of the psalm. Okay? So this may be a piece of some kind of public ritual
we
that
have this in our liturgy
died out.
On Yom Kippur. I don't know if it's in the Tzitzit Gates Repentance for Nehila, right?
Well, what happens? Yes, but in the traditional liturgy on Yom Tov, when you're putting the Torah back into the ark, instead of chanting Psalm 29, you chant Psalm 24.
24, okay.
Okay, it's also the psalm for Monday.
When you put
Is it Monday or Sunday? Sunday. It's a psalm for Sunday. One other quick thing in the Psalms. If you look at Psalm 2, and this is part of a subset of the ancient Israelite faith, within Judea, there was a royal cult, meaning the connection of the king, the descendant of David, to God. And by the way, most of our sources are from Judea, not the northern kingdom, because the northern kingdom was destroyed, and therefore most of our biblical sources are edited or collected by the southern Israelites, the Judeans. There are sources that we can probably trace to the north, but we also have to understand that another lens of interpretation is that we are mostly looking at Judean sources. And one of the trends in the Judean sources is what's called the royal cult, meaning making the king into a religious figure who is the Son of God. Not in the Christian sense, but in the sense that the king is like the Son of God in the king's intimacy with God and authority. And in Judea. This is around because the Davidic dynasty, because it was unbroken in Judea, developed a whole religious ideology around it, which ultimately in later Judaism became the concept of the Messiah. But if you take a look at Psalm 2, it's all about God and the king, right? Look at verse 2 on page 1413. The kings of the earth are like, and all the nations intrigue together against the Lord and his anointed, the king, right? And then later on, it says in verse 7, whereas in the first part it's speaking in third person, and then it's God talking, right? I've installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. There's all this connection with the notion of the holiness of the Temple Mount.
Those do meaning in like as a fight?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in verse 7 it says, let me tell of the decree. This is the poet talking. Actually this is the king talking. Verse 7.
Oh, 7.
The Lord said to me, you are my son, I have fathered you this day. Now you can understand Christians take this to refer to Jesus, but it's the king. It's the Davidic king, right? All right. So this is one poem that reflects this Davidic cult. All right, the royal cult. And that's a subsection, as I said. That's where you get this government-sponsored religion, right? Which, by the way, the dissidents are often also attacking that. They're not only attacking the practice of the people, but they are sometimes, especially in the prophets, they're going after the royal cult, right? What?
As well they should.
Well, because it represented an established order that they thought was corrupt and completely wrong. Okay, so number one, we will be looking at early texts. Number two, we will be looking at archaeological and inscriptional evidence from ancient Israel and surrounding peoples. Over the last more than 100 years, there's been an enormous amount of archaeological stuff that's been done in Israel. Archaeological stuff by nature is selective, and sometimes it's arguing from silence. Very often it doesn't jive with what's going on in the Bible, because the Bible, again, is the people who don't like this stuff. But one of the ways in which we can find out what the average Israelite was doing is looking at the remains of the people. And that includes shrines, temples, inscriptions, and stuff found in homes. That's one of the fascinating things, is that the ancient Israelites had a particular architectural layout of their houses that was unique to them. It's one of the way archaeologists are able to distinguish between Canaanite houses and Israelite houses. They have a totally different layout. And within those Israelite homes, they have found in some cases, what we would call little fertility figures. And there's a lot of argument over what those are. Are they goddesses, or are they like amulets, right? Which is a big difference. Okay? And then there are interesting inscriptions. One of the most important is what's the one here, the Kuntalat Ajrud, if I'm pronouncing that right, inscription, which is one of our only, most people feel, whoever did this inscription, drew a picture of God. It's one of the fascinating things you don't find in Israelite archaeology, is you don't find figures of God.
What is that mean?
Yeah, well, but you're looking at it from our perspective. The fact is, we actually have a source in the Bible itself who suggests that some Israelites did make images of God. There are a couple of things that seem to be images of God, but they're extremely rare, and that's because Northwest Semitic people in general tended to be what's called anti-iconic. They didn't like sculptured images of their gods. Unlike the Mesopotamians. No, I'm talking about the Canaanites, for example.
Isn't it in the Ten Commandments?
Yeah, but again, the Ten Commandments is again somebody who's going against maybe what Israelites in fact are actually doing, that they actually are making images of God. All right? For the most part, Israelites did not make images of God. There are some exceptions to that.
They said they don't need a law if people don't.
That's right.
Exactly.
This is Emil Durkheim's thing about law, is that if you see law, it's there because there were people who were violating that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another example of this is if the bullae. A bulla is a stamp, like a signature stamp, right? They have found hundreds of bullae from the late Second Temple period and even earlier. The late First Temple period and even earlier, some of which have the names of people from the Bible, by the way, from the book of Jeremiah specifically, including Jeremiah's scribe. We found his bullae, and in fact there's a fingerprint in the clay which suggests it's his fingerprint too, by the way, which is fascinating.
He can fly now in the airline.
Yeah.
Well, better than that.
The point is, in all of these bullae, as compared to Phoenician, Philistine, Canaanite bullae, you don't find figures of the gods. You find symbols, but you don't find figures of the gods for the most part. There's a few exceptions always, but in other cultures, when either the bullae or what's called a cylinder seal, which is a cylinder that would be rolled over clay. The bullae, by the way, was used to seal a document. So it was felt that, in fact, there was a huge collection that was found in Jerusalem. They originally may have, in fact, been seals on documents that got burned, part of a fire, but the fire preserved the seals. Okay? Anyway, you don't find images of gods or God in the Israelite or Judean bullae. You do tend to find them in the people of the surrounding areas. Okay? So that's the second thing. Archaeological stuff is fascinating. It's fragmentary. It has to be used, and there's a lot of arguments over the meaning of a lot of this stuff. The third part is what's called anthropological or ethnographical detail. Ethnographic detail from later Jewish, Christian, and Muslim practices, especially from the Middle East. Carol Myers does this. Again, it has to be used judiciously and carefully, but when you look at what often are called folkloric practices within Middle Eastern cultures before modernism had an impact on them, especially amongst women, you find certain rituals and practices that are extremely ancient and actually can shed light on some things that are alluded to in the Bible. Okay? Especially around the areas of fertility and childbirth and what we'll call healing. So, again, it has to be used very carefully, but there are scholars like Carol Myers who believe that you can learn something about ancient Israelite practices from later ethnographic studies of Jewish women, Christian and Muslim women from places like Iraq and Kurdistan and Yemen and places like that. Okay? Again, it's got to be used very carefully. Okay, so those are our sources for what we're going to look at. I wanted to give you a couple of just some stuff for you to have. Here's a basic timeline for the period we're talking about. The period we're most, of course, looking at is from around 1200 BCE to 586. So we're talking about 700 years. A long time. Now, I didn't give you the archaeological there's an archaeological periodization, by the way. This is more of a political periodization. There is another way to look at this, which is an archaeological periodization, and I didn't get a chance to do that chart. I wasn't sure whether I should. I think I'll give it to you next week, so you can see how archaeologists divide these years up. They talk about it in terms of the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and stuff like that. But it's interesting to sort of compare the two to see where the Israelites, in fact, appear on the scene in the Iron Age. They don't appear before that. Okay? Lastly, I've given you a couple of maps so that when we're talking about stuff, you can see sort of the main geographic areas. So the first map on page 4 is from the time when you had the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah, and you can see the approximate boundaries and the various other groups around them. Okay, that's important because some of our evidence comes from surrounding cultures. Okay, and then the last map is the general map of the ancient Near East, so you can see the larger empire or larger structures, because especially the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians at various times have occupied the area of page 4. In other words, this area of Judea and Israel and all the other little kingdoms around them were, for large periods of the time we're talking about, or part of the time we're talking about, were in fact vassal states to, if not the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. The one thing that is not on this map of the ancient Near East that you can put up around, Turkey, which is an earlier group that is pretty much off the scene by the time the Israelites arrived, but not 100% of the Hittites. There was a non-Semitic group of people in the area of Asia Minor who were the Hittites. They had an empire. They came in conflict with the Egyptians, and at the time of Ramses II, which is close to the traditional date of the Exodus, they had a big war. And the Hittites were completely destroyed by the Sea Peoples, who ended up being the Philistines.
When was this?
This is in the 13th century BCE. So right around the time of the emergence of Israel, you have the fall of the Hittite Empire. But that doesn't mean the Hittites there weren't Hittites around, right? Hittites are mentioned, in fact, in the Torah as being one of the Canaanite nations, which is completely wrong, but maybe there were some Hittites in the territory. But so that's just something else you should know. Okay? All right. So, couple of final things before we conclude today. So next week we are going to look at the belief system, and we're going to focus. And I will get you the material ahead of time, as I usually do. I have all your emails, so there'll be an email group for this class, and by Tuesday by mid-afternoon, you will receive the material that we will look at. If you can copy it off your own, please do. I'll always provide a few extras if people forget. And we'll be looking at some of these. What was the character of God? And specifically, when we talk about God, we're talking about the Israelite God, Yud-He, Vav-He, however you want to pronounce that. For my own particular reasons, I prefer not to pronounce it. Okay? Scholars,
I mean, you're not the high priest?
No, I'm not. Scholars do have probably a conjectural but probably accurate how that was pronounced. But Yud-He Vav-He is the God of Israel. You'll see that the Canaanite gods got assimilated into the conception of Yud-He Vav-He, and sometimes even the names of some of the Canaanite gods got brought into it. But that is one of the distinguishing elements of the Israelite religion, is that Yud-He Vav-He is the God of Israel. And that's important.
Isn't it one God, the whole world?
No, not originally. Not originally.